From 20,000 feet, a military base looks like a giant target painted on the ground. Rows of tents, vehicle tracks, supply depots, and hundreds of soldiers moving in organized patterns. To a reconnaissance pilot flying overhead, it's impossible to miss. Unless, of course, you make it disappear. During World War II, camouflage wasn't just about soldiers wearing green uniforms. It was an entire science dedicated to hiding massive military installations from enemy aircraft. We're talking about concealing thousands of troops, dozens of vehicles, and entire temporary cities from planes equipped with cameras that could photograph every detail below. The stakes were enormous. A single reconnaissance photo could reveal troop positions, supply routes, and offensive plans. Within hours, that information could lead to devastating airstrikes or artillery barrages. So Allied and Axis forces alike invested heavily in making their camps invisible from above. But how do you hide a camp that might cover several square miles? How do you conceal the movement of trucks, the smoke from cooking fires, and the worn paths created by thousands of marching boots? Aerial reconnaissance changed warfare forever. Before World War II, commanders could only guess at enemy positions based on scout reports and captured prisoners. By 1939, aircraft equipped with high-resolution cameras could photograph hundreds of square miles in a single mission. Photo interpreters would then study these images with magnifying glasses, identifying every tent, vehicle, gun emplacement, and troop movement. The quality of these photographs was remarkable. From 5 miles up, cameras could capture details small enough to identify individual vehicle types. A trained analyst could tell the difference between a supply truck and a fuel tanker just from the shape of its shadow. They could estimate the size of a military unit by counting latrines. They could predict offensive operations by tracking the buildup of ammunition dumps and artillery positions. This created a fundamental problem for military planners. Armies need bases. Soldiers need somewhere to sleep, eat, and store equipment. Vehicles need parking areas and maintenance facilities. All of this infrastructure creates a massive visual footprint that's nearly impossible to miss from the air. And it wasn't just about hiding the camp itself. Enemy analysts looked for patterns of activity over time. If reconnaissance flights photographed the same area on successive days, they could track changes. New roads appearing overnight, fresh vehicle tracks in the mud, the sudden absence of activity in a previously busy area. All of these details told a story to skilled interpreters. The consequences of being spotted were severe. In North Africa, German reconnaissance planes regularly photographed British positions. Within hours, Stuka dive bombers would arrive to destroy what had been identified. In Europe, Allied air superiority meant that any German concentration spotted from the air would face immediate attack. Units that failed to properly camouflage their positions often paid for it, with heavy casualties. That's why both sides poured resources into camouflage research and development. The British established the Camouflage Development and Training Center, where artists, scientists, and military personnel collaborated on concealment techniques. The Americans created specialized camouflage units within the Corps of Engineers. The Germans developed their own sophisticated systems, particularly for concealing armor and artillery. These weren't just a few soldiers throwing branches on tents. This was industrial-scale deception involving thousands of tons of specialized materials, detailed scientific analysis of how terrain looks from above, and constant innovation as reconnaissance technology improved. The challenge was unique in military history. Never before had armies needed to worry about being observed from directly overhead. Traditional fortifications were designed to resist horizontal attack. Trenches, walls, and defensive positions all assumed enemies would approach from ground level. But now, the enemy had a god's-eye view, seeing everything laid out like a map. So military forces had to fundamentally rethink how they organized and concealed their operations. They had to understand the principles of aerial observation, the limitations of photography, and the psychology of photo interpretation. They had to become experts in optics, color theory, shadow analysis, and the way human eyes and camera lenses perceive patterns from thousands of feet in the air. In this video, we'll look at the techniques, the technology, and the clever tricks that kept World War II military camps hidden in plain sight. From the massive camouflage nets that could cover entire vehicle parks to the subtle tricks of shadow elimination, from dummy installations that fooled enemy bombers to the smoke discipline that kept cooking fires invisible. We'll see how soldiers turned the science of concealment into an art form, and how that art form saved countless lives. Hiding a military camp from aerial observation meant understanding exactly what enemy pilots were looking for, and they were looking for patterns. The human brain is wired to recognize order, symmetry, and geometric shapes. It's an evolutionary trait that helped our ancestors spot predators and find food. In warfare, it became a liability. A natural forest has irregular spacing between trees, random distribution of clearings, and organic curves in streams and paths. A military camp has straight rows of tents, rectangular supply dumps, and roads that meet at perfect right angles. From above, these patterns stand out immediately. Even if individual tents are painted to blend with the ground, the overall organization gives everything away. Photo interpreters were trained to spot these geometric patterns. They knew that nature rarely creates perfect circles, straight lines, or evenly spaced objects. So when they saw these shapes in aerial photographs, they knew they were looking at human activity. The problem went deeper than just tent arrangement. Military organizations create patterns in everything they do. Latrines are dug in neat rows at specific distances from living areas, following field sanitation regulations. Vehicle parks organize trucks by type and unit. Command posts position themselves at specific distances from front lines. Supply depots stack materials in organized piles. All of these follow military doctrine, which makes them predictable and identifiable from the air. Then there's the issue of shadows. This was one of the most difficult challenges to overcome. Tents, vehicles, and buildings cast shadows that reveal their three-dimensional shape. A skilled photo interpreter could identify specific vehicle types just from shadow analysis. They could tell if a tent was occupied by how it sagged or stood firm. They could estimate the height of structures and determine whether camouflage netting was draped over something or just lying flat on the ground. Shadows also revealed activity. Fresh tire tracks cast tiny shadows that showed up in photographs taken during early morning or late afternoon when the sun was low. Footpads worn by soldiers appeared as lighter-colored lines because compressed soil reflected light differently than surrounding grass. Even something as simple as a tent stake driven into the ground would cast a small shadow that, when multiplied by hundreds of tents, created a recognizable pattern. The third major challenge was movement and activity. Camps aren't static. They're living, working environments where thousands of things happen every day. Vehicles arrive carrying supplies, kicking up dust that hangs in the air and shows up clearly in photographs. Soldiers move between areas, creating worn paths in vegetation. Cooking produces smoke, even when efforts are made to minimize it. Maintenance work on vehicles means parts and equipment spread around work areas. All of this generates what intelligence analysts call signatures. These signatures could be tracked over time. If reconnaissance planes photographed an area on Monday and again on Thursday, analysts would compare the images. New paths indicated increased activity. Fresh vehicle tracks suggested recent arrivals. Changes in tent layouts meant units were being reorganized. The disappearance of vehicles might indicate preparations for an offensive. Skilled interpreters could read these changes like a story unfolding across multiple photographs. Weather added another layer of complexity. Rain turns dirt roads into muddy tracks that are even more visible from above. Snow reveals every footprint, vehicle track, and warm building through melting patterns. Morning dew highlights the ground differently than dry soil, making camouflage that worked at noon completely ineffective at dawn. Seasonal changes meant that camouflage effective in summer became useless when leaves fell from trees in autumn. And then there's the problem of scale. You can hide a single vehicle fairly easily. Park it under a tree, throw some netting over it, and it becomes much harder to spot. But hiding an entire division is a different challenge altogether. A division might include 15,000 soldiers, hundreds of vehicles, artillery pieces, supply dumps covering acres of ground, field hospitals, communication centers, and all the support infrastructure needed to keep that many people functioning. Camouflaging all of this requires massive amounts of material. A single large camouflage net might weigh hundreds of pounds and take a dozen soldiers to deploy properly. Covering a battalion area could require miles of netting. The physical labor involved was enormous, and it had to be done quickly, often immediately upon arriving at a new position. Maintenance was equally demanding. Wind damages netting, tearing it loose from supports and creating gaps that reveal what's underneath. Rain weighs down fabric, causing nets to sag in unnatural ways. Sun fades colors, making camouflage that once blended perfectly with surroundings turn into obviously artificial coverings. Soldiers had to constantly inspect, repair, and adjust camouflage to maintain effectiveness. There was also the human factor. Discipline. Thousands of soldiers living in close quarters would naturally create visible patterns through their daily activities. They'd walk the same routes to latrines, wearing paths in the grass. They'd gather in certain areas during breaks, trampling vegetation. They'd take shortcuts between tents, creating diagonal paths that stood out against the organized layout. Maintaining effective camouflage meant maintaining constant discipline about movements, waste disposal, and activity patterns. That's why camouflage in World War II became a specialized field. It required dedicated units with trained personnel who understood not just how to drape netting, but why certain techniques worked and others failed. These specialists studied aerial photographs of their own positions to see what enemy observers would see. They learned to think like photo interpreters, identifying the telltale signs that would give away a position. The primary weapon against aerial observation was camouflage netting. But these weren't simple tarps thrown over equipment. They were sophisticated systems engineered specifically for overhead concealment. Military camouflage nets in World War II were typically made from jute, a natural fiber that could be dyed and wouldn't shine or reflect light like synthetic materials. The nets were woven with large irregular holes, creating a broken texture rather than a solid surface. Into these nets, workers would weave strips of colored fabric, burlap, or natural materials in multiple colors and irregular patterns. The color selection was scientific. Different terrains required different palettes. European forest operations used nets with dark greens, browns, and black tones that mimicked the appearance of dense woodland canopy from above. North African desert campaigns employed nets in tans, light browns, and dusty yellows. Some nets included multiple color schemes, with one side designed for summer vegetation and the reverse side for winter or autumn conditions. The texture was just as important as color. Nets were designed to create an irregular, mottled appearance that broke up the outline of structures underneath. Smooth, uniform surfaces catch light evenly and create recognizable shapes. Rough, uneven surfaces scatter light in multiple directions, making it harder for cameras to resolve clear images and harder for human eyes to identify specific objects. Installation required skill and attention to detail. Nets weren't simply draped directly over tents or vehicles. That would create an obvious artificial outline. Instead, they were suspended on frameworks of poles or wires, creating an irregular overhead canopy with space between the net and the objects below. This prevented the net from conforming to the shape of what it was hiding. The key was avoiding geometric regularity. Teams would intentionally create sags, wrinkles, and variations in height. They'd pull some sections tighter and let others drape loosely. They'd vary the height of support poles to create an undulating surface rather than a flat plane. From above, the result looked like natural terrain irregularities rather than artificial covering. But netting was just the beginning. Disrupting patterns was equally critical. Military doctrine had to be balanced against camouflage requirements. Yes, organized tent rows are efficient and make unit management easier, but they're also instantly recognizable from the air. So units learned to compromise, scattering tents in irregular clusters that resembled natural clearings while still maintaining enough organization for effective operations. Roads and paths presented special challenges. Vehicles need to move, and movement creates tracks. The solution was to route traffic through existing tree cover whenever possible, using natural concealment rather than trying to hide open roads. When roads had to cross open ground, they were covered with netting stretched across framework arches, creating tunnels that hid vehicle movement from above. In some cases, units would deliberately create false paths. These were tracks leading nowhere, designed to confuse photo interpreters about actual movement routes and camp locations. A false path might lead to an empty area while the real camp sat a quarter-mile away under heavy camouflage. Or multiple false paths might radiate from a small decoy position, suggesting a much larger installation than actually existed. Shadow management required creative engineering solutions. The basic problem was simple. You can hide an object's color and texture, but if it still casts a recognizable shadow, observers can identify what it is. Vehicles were particularly challenging because their distinctive shapes create characteristic shadows. The solution was called shadow elimination, though that's slightly misleading. Shadows can't be eliminated entirely, but they can be managed and disguised. One technique involved parking vehicles under natural tree cover, where their shadows would blend with the mottled shade pattern of branches and leaves. When natural cover wasn't available, units would construct artificial overhead frameworks that cast irregular, natural-looking shadows instead of revealing vehicle outlines. Some units went further, using painted canvas flats laid on the ground around vehicles. These flats would blend shadows into the surrounding terrain, breaking up the clear boundary between shadowed and sunlit areas that normally reveals object locations. The technique was labor-intensive but effective, especially for concealing critical assets like command vehicles or artillery pieces. Smoke discipline was absolutely critical, especially during early morning and late afternoon when low-angle sunlight made smoke columns highly visible. The problem was basic. Thousands of soldiers need hot food, and cooking produces smoke. The solution varied by situation and terrain. In forested areas, cooking was often concentrated in heavily covered locations where tree canopy would disperse smoke before it rose high enough to be visible from aircraft. In open terrain, units would sometimes use smokeless fuels, though these were often in short supply. Some operations restricted cooking to specific times when reconnaissance flights were less likely, based on intelligence about enemy air patrol schedules. The British and Americans developed particularly sophisticated deception techniques. In North Africa, before the Battle of El Alamein, the British constructed an entire dummy installation complete with fake tanks, trucks, and supply dumps in one location, while the real armor concentration was meticulously concealed miles away. They even had soldiers create false vehicle tracks and stage fake activity to make the dummy position look authentic. The fake tanks were masterpieces of deception. Built from wood frames covered with painted canvas, they looked remarkably realistic from the air. Some included details like fake gun barrels that cast appropriate shadows. Units would even move these dummies periodically to simulate real tank movements, maintaining the deception over weeks of preparation. Meanwhile, real combat units operated from concealed positions. Tank parks were hidden under camouflage nets reinforced with cut vegetation. Artillery pieces were positioned in existing tree lines or behind terrain features. Infantry camps were scattered and heavily camouflaged. The Germans photographed the dummy positions repeatedly, never suspecting the real threat was elsewhere. The Germans employed similar techniques before major offensives. They'd build elaborate false camps in obvious locations while hiding actual assault forces in dense woods or behind ridgelines. They'd stage fake supply buildups and troop movements to mislead Allied intelligence about where attacks would come. Speed of deployment was crucial. Specialized camouflage units could conceal a battalion-sized position in just a few hours. These teams knew exactly how to position netting for maximum effect, where to place natural vegetation for reinforcement, and how to eliminate the telltale signs that betrayed military presence. They also adapted constantly as technology evolved. When Allied forces began using infrared photography to detect heat signatures and see through some types of camouflage, new net materials were developed that reflected infrared light in patterns similar to natural vegetation. When oblique angle photography from low-flying aircraft revealed what vertical shots missed, netting techniques changed to account for side viewing angles. The camouflage specialists were artists and engineers combined. Many were recruited from civilian backgrounds in painting, theater set design, or architecture. They understood light, shadow, color theory, and human perception. They knew how cameras worked and what photo interpreters looked for. They could transform a visible military camp into something that looked, from above, like nothing more interesting than forest or field. Despite all these efforts, camouflage was never perfect. No matter how well executed, concealment had limitations that both attackers and defenders understood. Skilled photo interpreters could often detect concealed positions by looking for subtle indicators that most observers would miss. Fresh-cut vegetation used for camouflage would wilt within days, changing color from vibrant green to brown. This color change was obvious in aerial photographs, marking camouflage positions as clearly as signs. Units had to constantly replace vegetation, which meant constant work details and the risk that soldiers cutting branches would themselves be spotted. Camouflage nets showed where patterns that revealed underlying activity. Areas where vehicles moved frequently would develop worn patches in the netting. Sections over high-traffic walking paths would sag differently than sections over empty ground. These subtle differences in texture and shadow, invisible to casual observation, stood out clearly to trained analysts studying photos under magnification. Weather created additional problems that were difficult to solve. After rain, camouflage nets would dry at different rates than natural vegetation, creating temporary color mismatches. Snow would accumulate differently on artificial netting than on natural ground, revealing geometric patterns. In winter, heated buildings would melt snow around them in telltale patterns that couldn't be hidden. Sometimes, the very absence of activity became suspicious. Photo interpreters knew that truly empty terrain showed certain characteristics: birds landing, animals moving through, wind patterns creating natural disturbances. An area that looked strangely static, with no natural variations between photographs, suggested something might be concealed there. Skilled analysts would flag such areas for closer examination or additional reconnaissance. There was also the problem of operational necessity conflicting with camouflage requirements. Artillery pieces need clear fields of fire, which means they can't be buried under heavy concealment. Aircraft need runways that are, by nature, large flat geometric shapes impossible to hide. Supply trucks need roads, and roads create dust and tracks. Communication required antennas that had to extend above tree level. All of these operational requirements created compromises in camouflage effectiveness. That's why camouflage was never a standalone defense. It was always combined with other protective measures. Anti-aircraft guns protected camps even when concealed, providing defense if positions were spotted. Units practiced rapid dispersal procedures, ready to scatter if aircraft appeared overhead. Mobile units changed positions regularly, never staying in one location long enough for enemy intelligence to build up detailed information about their dispositions. Deception operations amplified camouflage effectiveness. False radio traffic might suggest a unit was in one location while it was actually concealed elsewhere. Dummy positions would be elaborately camouflaged to look like someone was trying to hide something important there, drawing attention away from real positions. Sometimes, units would deliberately allow certain positions to be photographed while concealing others, feeding false information to enemy analysis. The effectiveness of camouflage varied significantly by theater and tactical situation. In the dense forests of Europe, concealment was relatively easier. Heavy tree cover provided natural concealment that could be reinforced with netting and careful positioning. Units operating in French forests or German woodlands could achieve excellent concealment with moderate effort. Desert terrain was far more challenging. North Africa offered little natural cover, making any military presence stand out starkly. Camouflage there relied more on deception and dummy positions than on actual concealment. Units would often operate at night and remain absolutely still during daylight hours, relying on distance and heat shimmer to obscure them rather than on physical camouflage. Island operations in the Pacific presented unique challenges. Dense jungle provided excellent concealment, but made movement and supply extremely difficult. Japanese forces became experts at using natural caves and vegetation for concealment, creating positions that were nearly impossible to spot from the air but could be maintained for extended periods. Static positions like airfields and major supply depots were the hardest to conceal. An airfield requires acres of flat, open ground, massive fuel storage facilities, maintenance hangars, and supporting infrastructure. All of this is inherently visible. Efforts to camouflage such installations focused on making them look abandoned or less important than they were, rather than hiding them completely. Mobile infantry camps were easier to conceal, but required constant discipline. A battalion could move into a forested area, set up concealed positions, and remain virtually invisible from the air if soldiers followed procedures. But one cook fire in the wrong location, one vehicle parked in the open, or one soldier hanging laundry in a visible clearing could compromise the entire position. The men who specialized in camouflage work were unsung heroes of World War II. They weren't in combat units and rarely received recognition, but their work directly impacted survival rates and operational success. A well-camouflaged position might avoid attack entirely. A poorly concealed one would face air strikes or artillery bombardment within hours of being spotted. These camouflage specialists worked in all weather conditions, often under severe time pressure. They might arrive at a new position with an infantry unit and have only hours to establish effective concealment before enemy reconnaissance flights passed overhead. They worked through rain, snow, and heat, constantly adjusting and maintaining their concealment systems. They studied aerial photographs of their own positions, identifying weaknesses that enemy interpreters might exploit. They experimented with new materials and techniques. They taught ordinary soldiers the principles of camouflage discipline. They were artists, engineers, and teachers combined into roles that rarely appeared in official histories, but were absolutely essential to operations. World War II camouflage wasn't about making things invisible. That was never possible. It was about making them uninteresting, unremarkable, and difficult to interpret correctly. A well-camouflaged camp didn't vanish from aerial photographs. It just looked like more forest, more desert, or more empty landscape. It lacked the geometric patterns, the organized shadows, and the activity signatures that trained interpreters associated with military positions. And in a war where information meant survival, where a single reconnaissance photograph could doom thousands of soldiers to air attack, that was often good enough. The goal was never perfect invisibility. It was plausible deniability, making enemy intelligence officers uncertain about what they were seeing, forcing them to waste resources investigating false positions while real units remained concealed. The techniques developed during World War II laid the foundation for all modern military concealment. Today's thermal camouflage systems, radar-absorbent materials, and digital disruption patterns all evolved from those early efforts to hide canvas tints from reconnaissance pilots flying overhead. The technology has become vastly more sophisticated, but the fundamental principles remain unchanged. In warfare, what the enemy cannot clearly see and correctly identify, they cannot effectively target. That principle drove World War II camouflage efforts and continues to drive military concealment research today. The soldiers who hid their camps from enemy planes understood that survival often depended not on fighting harder, but on not being found at all.